December 14, 1944. Near Bastogne, Belgium. The forest was silent in the way that forests become silent before something terrible happens. Snow fell through the bare branches of oak and pine, settling on frozen ground already covered by 3 days of accumulation. The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees Celsius. Each breath formed clouds that hung in the air for seconds before dissolving. Private First Class Robert Chandler crouched behind a fallen tree, his M1 Garand resting across his knees. He was 22 years old. He had been in Belgium for 17 days. He had killed 3 men he was certain of, and perhaps 2 more he could not confirm. The 5th Wehrmacht soldier he had shot had fallen into a ravine and Chandler never saw the body, though he heard the man scream as he fell. Chandler's hands were numb inside his wool gloves. His feet had lost feeling 2 hours ago. The army had not issued proper winter boots. They wore the same leather combat boots they had trained in at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the temperature never dropped below freezing. Now those same boots, soaked through from marching through snow, had become instruments of suffering. The 101st Airborne Division was dug in along a defensive line north of Bastogne. Intelligence had reported German movement in the sector. Panzer divisions were moving west through the Ardennes. The word came down that this was not a probe. This was a full offensive. The Wehrmacht was pushing everything they had toward the Meuse River. But here, in this particular forest, on this particular afternoon, there was only silence. And snow. And cold that burned the lungs with each breath. Chandler had not eaten a hot meal in 4 days. He had not slept more than 2 hours at a time in 6 days. He had not felt truly warm since landing in France. The sea rations in his pack were frozen solid. He had tried eating them anyway, scraping at the solid mass with his combat knife, but his jaw hurt from chewing frozen hash. Next to him, Corporal James Sullivan kept watch toward the east. Sullivan was older, 28, from Boston. He had a wife and a daughter he had never met, born 3 months after he shipped out. He carried a photograph of his wife in his helmet liner. He never showed it to anyone, but Chandler had seen him looking at it during quiet moments when he thought no one was watching. "You hear that?" Sullivan whispered. Chandler listened. Nothing. Just wind moving through bare branches. Just snow falling. Just his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Don't hear anything," Chandler said. "Exactly," Sullivan said. "No birds. No squirrels. Nothing." They waited. Minutes passed like hours. The cold worked its way through every layer of clothing. Through wool uniforms and canvas overcoats and cotton long underwear. Through skin and muscle down to bone. Chandler flexed his fingers inside his gloves, trying to maintain circulation. His trigger finger had gone numb. That was dangerous. A man with a numb trigger finger was a dead man. Then they heard it. A branch snapping. Not the crack of a branch breaking under snow weight. The sharp snap of a branch stepped on by something heavy. Something moving. Sullivan raised his Thompson submachine gun. Chandler brought up his Garand. They had been trained to fire without thinking. Point, acquire target, squeeze trigger, fire. Do not hesitate. Hesitation means death. The enemy does not hesitate. You do not hesitate. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards out, movement. Gray-white shapes moving between the dark trunks. German winter camouflage. Wehrmacht soldiers advancing in a skirmish line. Chandler counted 5. 6. 7 men. "Wait for it," Sullivan whispered. The Germans came closer. 40 yards. 35. Chandler could see their faces now. Young faces. Boys really. One looked even younger than Chandler. 19 maybe. Baby fat still visible in his cheeks despite months of poor rations and hard marching. 30 yards. Sullivan opened fire first. The Thompson roared, spitting .45 caliber rounds at 700 rounds per minute. The sound shattered the forest silence like glass breaking. Chandler fired 2 seconds later. His first round caught a German soldier in the chest. The man spun and fell. His second round missed. His third struck another soldier in the shoulder. The Germans scattered, diving for cover behind trees and into shell craters. Return fire came immediately. Mauser rounds cracked through the air. Bark exploded from the tree trunk 6 inches above Chandler's head. He pressed himself flat against the frozen ground. The firefight lasted 4 minutes. In combat, 4 minutes is an eternity. Time stretches. Seconds become minutes. Minutes become hours. The world narrows to muzzle flashes and the crack of rifle fire and the smell of cordite and pine sap and frozen earth. Then it stopped. The Germans withdrew, falling back through the trees toward the east. Chandler and Sullivan did not pursue. They were not supposed to pursue. They were supposed to hold their position. That was the order. Hold the line. Do not advance. Do not retreat. Hold. Sullivan reloaded his Thompson with shaking hands. His face was pale. He had fired nearly 60 rounds. Chandler had fired 8. Both men were breathing hard, their breath coming in ragged gasps that formed clouds in the freezing air. "Think we got any of them?" Sullivan asked. "Saw 2 go down for sure," Chandler said. "Maybe 3. They waited another 10 minutes. The forest returned to its terrible silence. Snow continued falling. The light was fading. Dusk came early in December, especially in forests, especially in Belgium. "I'm going to check the bodies," Chandler said. "What? Why?" "Intelligence wants documents. Maps. Orders. Anything that tells us what they're planning." "Chandler, we don't." "I'll be quick." Before Sullivan could object further, Chandler rose from cover and moved forward in a low crouch. His legs protested after being still for so long in the cold. His knees popped. His feet burned as circulation returned. He kept his Garand up, safety off, finger near the trigger guard. He found the first body 30 yards out. A Wehrmacht soldier, maybe 25 years old, shot through the throat. Blood had pooled beneath him, already frozen in the snow. Chandler searched the man's pockets quickly. Nothing. No papers. No maps. Just a letter from home, written in German, which Chandler could not read. He left it. The second body was 10 yards further. This soldier was older, maybe 30. He had been shot in the chest. His eyes were still open, staring up at the gray sky. Chandler closed them. He did not know why he did this. He had been taught not to touch enemy dead unless searching them. But something about those open eyes bothered him. He closed them and moved on. The third soldier was not dead. Chandler found him behind a fallen log, lying on his side, both hands pressed against his abdomen. Blood leaked between his fingers. Not the bright arterial spray that meant death in minutes, but the darker venous flow that meant death in hours. The soldier looked up as Chandler approached. Their eyes met. The German was young. Very young. 18 perhaps. He had blonde hair beneath his Stahlhelm helmet. Blue eyes. Clean-shaven face, though he looked like he had not shaved in days. His winter camouflage uniform was soaked with blood. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His lips were blue from cold and shock. Chandler should have shot him. That was protocol. Enemy wounded were intelligence assets or they were mercy killings, depending on their condition. A gut-shot man was a dead man. Better to end it quickly than let him suffer for hours in the snow. Chandler raised his rifle. The German said something in German. Chandler did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. The soldier was not asking for mercy. He was not begging for his life. He was simply stating a fact. Maybe saying he was cold. Maybe saying he was dying. Maybe saying he wanted his mother. Chandler lowered his rifle. He knelt beside the German soldier, setting his Garand within reach but not pointing it at the man. He pulled out his aid kit, the small canvas pouch every soldier carried with bandages and sulfa powder and a single morphine syringe. His hands moved automatically, trained by countless drills. Cut away uniform. Expose wound. Apply sulfa powder. Pack wound with gauze. Bandage. The German watched him work. His eyes never left Chandler's face. He said something else in German. Chandler shook his head. Don't speak German, he said. Sorry. The German seemed to understand. He nodded slightly. Then, with great effort, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. A photograph. He held it toward Chandler with a trembling hand. The photograph showed a young woman and a small child. The woman was pretty, dark-haired, smiling at the camera. The child, a boy maybe 2 years old, sat on her lap. They were standing in front of a house somewhere. Flowers in the garden. Mountains in the background. The photo was worn at the edges from being carried and looked at many times. Family, the German said. Frau. Sohn. Chandler understood. Wife. Son. Family. He looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked at the German soldier's face. The man was crying now, tears running down his cheeks, though whether from pain or from thinking about his family or from knowing he would never see them again, Chandler could not tell. Chandler should have walked away. He should have returned to his position. He should have reported the wounded enemy combatant and let someone else deal with it. But he did not. Instead, he took the photograph and looked at it closely. The woman had kind eyes. The child had his father's blonde hair. She's pretty, Chandler said, knowing the German could not understand. Your boy looks like you. The German smiled slightly. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. His breathing was becoming more labored. The wound was worse than Chandler had thought. The bullet had probably nicked his liver or his kidney. He was bleeding internally. Nothing Chandler could do would save him. Nothing anyone could do would save him. Chandler pulled out his morphine syringe. He uncapped it and injected the morphine into the German's thigh through his uniform. The soldier's eyes widened slightly, then began to glaze as the drug took effect. The pain would fade now. The cold would fade. He would drift away rather than suffer through every minute of his death. You'll see them again, Chandler said quietly. Your wife. Your son. You'll see them again. He did not believe in an afterlife. He had not been to church since basic training. But it seemed like the right thing to say. The German's breathing slowed. His hand, still holding the photograph, began to relax. Chandler reached out and carefully took the photo from the dying man's fingers. He looked at it again. The woman. The child. The house with flowers and mountains. He put the photograph in his own jacket pocket. He sat with the German soldier for another 5 minutes. He did not speak. There was nothing left to say. He simply sat there in the snow while the light faded and the temperature dropped and somewhere in the distance artillery began to rumble. When the German's breathing finally stopped, Chandler closed the man's eyes, as he had done with the other soldier earlier. Then he stood, picked up his rifle, and walked back through the forest to where Sullivan was waiting. Find anything? Sullivan asked. No, Chandler said. Nothing useful. That night, in his foxhole, wrapped in a frozen blanket, Chandler took out the photograph and looked at it by moonlight. The woman. The child. He studied their faces until he had memorized every detail. Then he put the photo back in his pocket, next to his heart, where it would stay warm. He had killed the man in this photograph. He had taken a husband from a wife. He had taken a father from a son. And now he carried their image against his chest like a wound that would never heal. January 1945. Bastogne. The siege had been lifted. The 101st Airborne held. Patton's Third Army broke through from the south. The Germans withdrew, leaving behind their dead and their wounded and their burned-out tanks. The Battle of the Bulge was turning. The Wehrmacht's last great offensive was failing. But the forest near Bastogne remained a cemetery. Bodies lay frozen beneath the snow. Some would not be found until spring. Some would never be found at all. Chandler survived. He survived the artillery barrages and the German attacks and the cold that killed as many men as bullets. He survived the fighting withdrawal through the forests and the desperate defensive crossroads and the slow, grinding counterattack that pushed the Germans back east. He survived, but something inside him had changed. He carried the photograph everywhere. It became a ritual. Every morning when he woke, he checked to make sure it was still in his pocket. Every night before sleeping, he took it out and looked at it. The woman. The child. The house with flowers. He knew their faces better than he knew his own. His platoon noticed but said nothing. Many soldiers carried photographs. Pictures of wives, girlfriends, mothers, sisters, children. Pieces of home carried into hell. But Chandler carried a photograph of people he had never met. A woman who was not his wife. A child who was not his son. Sullivan asked once, during a lull in the fighting, while they sat in a barn cleaning their weapons. "That your family?" Sullivan gestured to the photo Chandler was holding. Chandler looked up, startled. He had not realized he had taken it out. "No," he said. "Just, someone I knew." Sullivan nodded and returned to cleaning his Thompson. He did not ask again. February 1945. The advance continued. The Allies pushed into Germany itself. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, though they fought on with desperate tenacity. Every village became a battlefield. Every farmhouse became a fortress. Men died in places whose names they could not pronounce. Chandler killed more Germans. He stopped counting after 12. The killing became routine. Point, acquire, fire. Do not think. Do not hesitate. The human face across the sights became just another target. Just another gray-green uniform to be eliminated. But at night, he looked at the photograph. The woman. The child. They reminded him that every German soldier he killed had been someone's husband. Someone's son. Someone's father. Each death rippled outward like stones dropped in water, creating waves of grief that would last for years, for decades, for lifetimes. March 1945. The 101st Airborne was pulled off the line for rest and refit. They were sent to a town in eastern France that had been liberated months earlier. Real beds. Hot food. Showers. The luxury of sleeping without a rifle within arm's reach. Chandler wrote a letter home to his mother in Ohio. He had not written in 6 weeks. He told her he was fine. He told her the food was good. He told her he was looking forward to coming home. He did not tell her about the German soldier. He did not tell her about the photograph. He did not tell her that he could no longer sleep more than 2 hours at a time without waking from dreams of men dying in snow. He sealed the letter and addressed it and put it in the outgoing mail bag. Then he sat on his bunk and took out the photograph and stared at it until his eyes hurt. Corporal Sullivan sat down next to him. "You ever going to tell me about that photo?" Chandler was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I took it off a German soldier." "A dead German soldier? Dying? Got shot? Nothing I could do for him?" Sullivan nodded slowly. "And you kept his family photo? Why?" Chandler did not answer right away. He looked down at the faces in the photograph. The woman's smile. The child's innocent eyes. "I don't know," he finally said. "I just couldn't leave it there. In the snow. With his body. It felt wrong." "So you're carrying it for him? Like a, what? A memorial?" "Maybe," Chandler said. "Or maybe I'm just trying to remember that he was a person. That they're all people. That every man I kill has someone waiting for him to come home." Sullivan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a hell of a weight to carry, Chandler." "Yeah," Chandler said. "Yeah, it is." April 1945. Germany. The war was ending. Anyone with eyes could see it. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. The Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. American and British forces pushed from the west. The Third Reich was collapsing like a building with its foundations removed. But men still died. Bullets still flew. Artillery still fell. The Germans fought on, not from any hope of victory but from orders and habit and the simple terrible momentum of war that cannot stop until one side or the other can no longer continue. The 101st Airborne crossed the Rhine. They advanced through German towns and villages. They saw things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Concentration camps. Slave labor factories. Mass graves. The machinery of genocide laid bare. Chandler walked through Buchenwald 3 days after its liberation. He saw the crematorium ovens. He saw the gas chambers. He saw the survivors, walking skeletons with eyes that had seen the absolute depths of human evil. And he thought about the photograph in his pocket. The woman. The child. The house with flowers. Had that German soldier known? Had he participated? Had he stood guard at camps like this? Had he helped round up Jews and Roma and political prisoners and sent them to their deaths? Or had he simply been a soldier, fighting for his country, ignorant of the horrors being committed in his nation's name? Chandler would never know. The man was dead in a Belgian forest, buried under snow that had long since melted. His name was unknown. His unit was unknown. His crimes or his innocence were unknown. But his family was real. The woman in the photograph existed somewhere. The child existed somewhere. They were waiting for him to come home. And he never would. May 1945. The war in Europe ended. Hitler was dead. Germany surrendered. Church bells rang across the Allied nations. Soldiers celebrated. Champagne bottles were opened. Men who had been certain they would die now knew they would live. Chandler felt nothing. He sat on his bunk in a requisitioned German house and took out the photograph and looked at it and felt absolutely nothing. No joy. No relief. No triumph. Just a vast emptiness that filled every space inside him. Sullivan found him there an hour later. Chandler. The war's over. We won. We're going home. Chandler looked up. Yeah, he said quietly. Home. Aren't you happy? Christ, we survived. We made it through. Did we? Chandler asked. He held up the photograph. Did all of us make it through? Sullivan's smile faded. That's different. He was the enemy. Was he? Chandler said. Or was he just a kid with a wife and son who got conscripted and sent to die in a forest for a cause he might not have even believed in? You can't think like that, Sullivan said. You'll drive yourself crazy. He was trying to kill us. We were trying to kill him. That's war. I know that's war, Chandler said. That's exactly what's wrong. The 101st Airborne remained in Germany through the summer of 1945. Occupation duty. Displaced persons camps. Collecting weapons from surrendering Wehrmacht units. Processing prisoners. The machinery of victory. Chandler volunteered for every mission that took him into German towns and villages. He was looking for something, though he could not articulate what. He showed the photograph to German civilians. To refugees. To former soldiers. Do you recognize these people? This woman? This child? Do you know where they might be? No one recognized them. Germany had 80 million people. The photograph could be from anywhere. From a city. From a small village. From a farm in Bavaria or a town on the Baltic coast. Without a name, without a location, the search was impossible. But Chandler kept trying. November 1945. New York Harbor. The troop ship passed the Statue of Liberty. Thousands of soldiers lined the rails, cheering, waving, crying. They were home. They had survived. The nightmare was over. Chandler stood among them, his duffel bag at his feet, the photograph in his jacket pocket. He looked at the statue. At the city beyond. At the country he had left 2 years ago. He had been 20 when he deployed. He was 23 now. Only 3 years. But he felt a century older. The ship docked. Processing took hours. Papers signed. Forms filled out. Medical exams. Discharge papers issued. Then they were released. Free men. Citizens again. No longer soldiers. Chandler took a train to Ohio. He sat in the passenger car and watched America roll past the window. Farmland. Small towns. Cities. Everything looked the same as when he had left. But nothing felt the same. The country had not changed. He had changed. The distance between him and everyone else who had not been to war was unbridgeable. His mother met him at the train station in Columbus. She cried when she saw him. She hugged him for a long time. She said he looked thin. She said he looked tired. She said she had prayed for him every single day. Chandler hugged her back and said nothing. There was nothing to say. No words existed that could convey what he had seen. What he had done. What he carried. They drove home in his father's Ford. His mother talked the entire way. Neighbors who had asked about him. Relatives who wanted to see him. The victory celebrations the town had held when Germany surrendered. The rationing ending. The return to normal life. Normal life. Chandler did not remember what that meant. His childhood bedroom had been preserved like a museum. His high school pennant still hung on the wall. His baseball glove sat on the dresser. His books lined the shelf. Everything exactly as he had left it. As if he could simply pick up his old life where it had been interrupted. But that person, that boy who had lived in this room, was dead. He had died in a Belgian forest along with a young German soldier who carried a photograph of his wife and child. December 1945. Chandler tried to adapt. He tried to be the son his parents remembered. He attended church on Sundays. He had dinner with extended family. He went to a welcome home dance at the town hall where people thanked him for his service and told him they were proud of him. He smiled. He shook hands. He said the appropriate words. But inside, he felt nothing. He was a ghost walking through a life that no longer fit him. At night, he took out the photograph. The woman. The child. They were more real to him than anything in his current life. They represented something true. Something honest. Something that mattered. His mother found him looking at it one evening. "Who is that?" she asked. "Someone I knew," Chandler said. The same answer he had given Sullivan. "From the war?" "Yes." She looked at the photograph more closely. "She's very pretty. Is that your young man?" Chandler could have explained. He could have told her the truth. But he did not. "Yes," he said simply. "That's my boy." His mother smiled and touched his shoulder gently. "You never mentioned them in your letters." "No," Chandler said. "I didn't." She waited for him to say more. When he did not, she kissed his forehead and left him alone with his thoughts and his photograph and his guilt. Part 5, The Silence. 1946 to 1950, the years passed. Chandler got a job at a factory that made automobile parts. He worked 40 hours a week operating a drill press. The work was steady. The pay was decent. It required no thinking. He could lose himself in the rhythm of the machine. Drill. Check. Move. Repeat. 8 hours a day. 5 days a week. Month after month. He dated occasionally. Nice girls his mother introduced him to. Daughters of her friends. Girls from church. They were pleasant. They were attractive. They were interested in him. But something always ended things before they became serious. He could not explain it. They were good women. They would have made good wives. But there was a distance he could not cross. A wall between him and everyone who had not been where he had been. Who had not done what he had done. The photograph remained in his pocket. Every day. Every night. At work, pressed against his chest while he operated the drill press. At home, on his nightstand while he slept. He never went anywhere without it. The photograph was more permanent than any job, any relationship, any part of his post-war life. Sullivan had been right. It was a hell of a weight to carry. But Chandler could not put it down. In 1948, he met a woman named Dorothy at a church social. She was kind. She was patient. She did not push him to talk about the war. They courted for 6 months. They married in a small ceremony in June 1949. Chandler tried to be a good husband. He was faithful. He provided. He came home every night. But there was a part of himself he could never give her. A part that remained in a Belgian forest with a dying German soldier. Dorothy knew something was wrong. Women always know. But she did not ask. Perhaps she understood that some things could not be asked about. Some doors should remain closed. They bought a small house on the east side of Columbus. Chandler painted it yellow, though he could not remember why. He planted flowers in the front yard. Roses. Daffodils. Nothing special. Just flowers. Every evening after work, he sat on the porch and smoked a cigarette and took out the photograph and looked at it. Dorothy watched him from the kitchen window but never commented. It became part of their unspoken agreement. She would not ask. He would not explain. In 1951, their first child was born. A son. They named him James, after Sullivan, who had been killed in Korea the year before. Chandler held his son in the hospital and felt something crack inside his chest. The baby was so small. So fragile. So completely dependent on others for survival. He thought of the child in the photograph. That boy would be 13 years old now. Old enough to understand that his father was never coming home. Old enough to have spent most of his life without his father's presence. Had the German soldier held his son like this? Had he felt this overwhelming terror that the world would hurt this tiny person? Had he gone to war believing he was protecting his child, only to die in a frozen forest and leave his son to grow up alone? Chandler handed the baby back to Dorothy. He walked out of the hospital and sat in his car and cried for the first time since the war ended. He cried for the German soldier. He cried for the woman in the photograph who had lost her husband. He cried for the child who had lost his father. He cried for himself and for what the war had taken from him. Then he dried his eyes and went back inside and pretended everything was fine. 1960 to 1970, more years passed. James grew. A second child arrived, a daughter named Sarah. Chandler worked. Dorothy kept house. They went to church. They had barbecues with neighbors. They took vacations to places like Cleveland and Cincinnati. They lived what appeared to be a normal American life. But the photograph never left Chandler's pocket. James noticed it when he was 10 years old. "Dad, who are those people?" Chandler was sitting on the porch, looking at the photo as he did every evening. He looked down at his son. James had grown tall for his age. He had Chandler's dark hair and Dorothy's green eyes. He was a good kid. Smart. Curious. Kind. "They're from the war," Chandler said. "Were they friends of yours?" "No," Chandler said. "Not friends." "Then why do you keep their picture?" Chandler looked at the photograph. At the woman's face. At the child's face. He had looked at this image thousands of times. Tens of thousands. Every day for 15 years. Their faces were burned into his memory more deeply than his own mother's face. "Because I need to remember," Chandler said. "Remember what?" "That they were real." James did not understand. He was too young to understand. He accepted his father's answer and went inside to play. In 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. The nation mourned. Chandler felt nothing. He had seen too much death to be shocked by one more. Even a president's death seemed small compared to the mountains of corpses he had walked past in Germany. Dorothy found him on the porch that night, holding the photograph. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," Chandler said. It was a lie, but it was the lie they had both agreed to live with. "I know about the photograph," Dorothy said quietly. Chandler looked up at her, surprised. "I've always known," she continued. "I've seen you with it. Every day. Every night. For 14 years. "I can explain," Chandler began. "No," Dorothy interrupted gently. "You don't need to explain. I don't need to know who they are. I just need you to know that whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." She sat down next to him. She took his hand. They sat together in silence while the sun set and the streetlights came on and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. "I killed him," Chandler said finally. The words came out quietly, barely more than a whisper. "The man in this photograph. I shot him. He died in my arms." Dorothy squeezed his hand but said nothing. "He had a wife," Chandler continued. "A son. A home. A life. And I took it from him. I took everything from him." "You were at war," Dorothy said. "You were both at war. Does that make it better? Does that justify it?" "He's still dead." His wife is still a widow. His son grew up without a father. And I'm the reason. You were following orders. Orders don't absolve us of what we do. Orders don't make it right. They just make it legal. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Dorothy asked, what was his name? I don't know, Chandler admitted. I never knew his name. I never even tried to find out. I just took his photograph and carried it like some kind of penance. Like if I remembered him, it would somehow balance the scales. Does it? Dorothy asked. Does it balance them? No, Chandler said. Nothing balances them. Nothing ever will. Dorothy leaned her head on his shoulder. Then why keep carrying it? Because someone has to remember him, Chandler said. Someone has to know that he existed. That he mattered. That his death meant something more than just another casualty statistic. They sat together until full darkness came. Then they went inside and went to bed and never spoke of it again. 1975 to 1980, Chandler retired from the factory. He was 53 years old. He had worked at the same place for 30 years. They gave him a gold watch and a pension and a small party where people he barely knew made speeches about his loyalty and dedication. He went home and sat on his porch and took out the photograph and looked at it. The woman. The child. The image had faded over the years. The edges were worn thin from being handled. But the faces were still clear. Still recognizable. Still haunting. James was grown now, married with children of his own. Sarah was in college studying to be a teacher. Dorothy was planning to retire from her job at the library in 2 years. Their lives were good. Comfortable. The American dream realized. But Chandler could not rest. He began spending his days at the library, researching. He requested books through interlibrary loan. Books about the Battle of the Bulge. Books about German military units. Books about Wehrmacht soldiers. He studied maps of the Ardennes. He tried to determine which German division had been in that particular forest on December 14, 1944. The librarians thought he was writing a book. Dorothy thought he was processing his memories. Only Chandler knew the truth. He was looking for a name. A single name out of millions of German soldiers who had fought in the war. It was an impossible task. The records were incomplete. Many had been destroyed in the bombing of German cities. Many units had burned their records in the final days of the war to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. And even if the records existed, they were scattered across archives in Germany, in America, in Russia. But Chandler kept searching. In 1977, he contacted the Army's Historical Division. He requested unit records for the area near Bastogne in December 1944. They sent him photocopied documents. Lists of German units identified in the sector. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division. The 2nd Panzer Division. Elements of the 9th Panzer Division. Too many units. Too many men. Impossible to narrow down. He wrote letters to veterans organizations in Germany. He described the uniform the German soldier had been wearing. The winter camouflage. The Stahlhelm helmet. The location where he had fallen. He asked if anyone remembered. If anyone knew. Most letters went unanswered. A few came back with polite regrets. No one remembered a specific soldier dying in a specific forest on a specific day. Thousands of German soldiers had died during the Battle of the Bulge. Tens of thousands. One more casualty among so many was impossible to identify. But Chandler kept trying. Dorothy watched his obsession grow with quiet concern. "Why are you doing this?" she asked one evening as he sat surrounded by maps and documents and letters. "I need to know his name," Chandler said. "Why? What difference does it make now? He's been dead for 33 years. "It makes a difference to me," Chandler said. "I killed him. I should at least know his name." "What will you do if you find it?" Dorothy asked. Chandler was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll find his family. I'll return the photograph. I'll tell them he didn't die alone. That someone was with him at the end. And you think that will bring you peace?" "I don't know," Chandler admitted. "But I have to try." 1984, 40 years after that December day in Belgium. Chandler was 62 years old. His hair had gone completely gray. His hands shook slightly from early-stage Parkinson's disease. He moved slower than he once had. But his eyes were still sharp. His memory was still clear. And the photograph was still in his pocket. He had never found the German soldier's name. After years of searching, he had finally accepted that he never would. The man would remain forever unknown. A ghost without a name. A casualty without a face, except for the face Chandler carried in his pocket and in his memory. But he had found something else. Through a veterans organization in Germany, he had located the town that matched the photograph's background. A small village in Bavaria near Garmisch-Partenkirchen. The mountains in the background. The distinctive architecture of the house. An archivist had identified it with reasonable certainty. Chandler made a decision. He would go to Germany. He would go to that village. He would try one last time to find the woman in the photograph. To return what he had carried for 40 years. Dorothy insisted on coming with him. "You're not doing this alone," she said. "Not after 40 years. Not anymore." They flew to Germany in September. It was Chandler's first time back since 1945. The country had changed beyond recognition. The ruins had been rebuilt. The cities gleamed. The economy thrived. West Germany had become one of the most prosperous nations in Europe. But something of the old Germany remained. The forests. The villages. The mountains. These had not changed. They rented a car and drove south from Frankfurt toward Bavaria. The autumn colors were spectacular. Golden leaves on the trees. Clear blue skies. The kind of beautiful day that made war seem impossible. The village was small. Perhaps 500 residents. A church. A town hall. A single main street with shops. Houses with flower boxes. Mountains rising in the background, snow-capped peaks against the horizon. Chandler parked the car in the town square. He sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, the photograph in his hand. After 40 years, he was finally here. The place where that woman had stood with her child, smiling at a camera, never knowing that her husband would die in a foreign land and that a stranger would carry her image for decades. They asked at the town hall. An elderly woman behind a desk looked at the photograph carefully. "I do not recognize them," she said in accented English. "But this photo is very old." 40 years, you say? Many people have moved away. Died. The war changed everything. Is there anyone who might remember? Chandler asked. Someone who lived here during the war. The woman thought for a moment. Try the church. Father Hermann has been here since 1950. He might know. Father Hermann was in his 80s. He received them in his office, a small room lined with books. He examined the photograph for a long time. His hands, gnarled with arthritis, trembled slightly as he held it. "This house," he said slowly, "I recognize this house. It belonged to the Hoffman family. Karl Hoffman and his wife Greta." Chandler's heart began to pound. "Do they still live here?" Father Hermann shook his head slowly. "Karl died during the war. Greta lived here until 1956. Then she moved to Munich to live with her son. I do not know if she is still alive. She would be very old now. In her 80s perhaps. Do you know where in Munich?" Dorothy asked. "No," Father Hermann said. "I'm sorry. We lost touch after she left. But her son's name was Peter. Peter Hoffman. Perhaps you could find him through city records. Munich. 3 hours north. A city of 1 million people. Finding one family among so many would be difficult. But not impossible. Not anymore." They drove to Munich the next day. They spent 2 days searching city records, contacting offices, following leads. Finally, through the pension office, they found an address. Peter Hoffman. Now 52 years old. Living in a suburb east of the city center. Chandler stood outside the apartment building for 10 minutes before knocking. Dorothy stood beside him, holding his hand. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I don't know," Chandler said honestly. I've carried this for 40 years. I don't know if I'm ready to let it go. You don't have to let it go, Dorothy said gently. You're giving it back to where it belongs. Chandler nodded. He climbed the stairs to the second floor. He found the door. He knocked. A man answered. Tall. Blonde hair going gray. Blue eyes. The same blue eyes from the photograph, now aged 4 decades. This was the child. The boy who had sat on his mother's lap while his father went to war and never returned. Yes, the man said in German. Then, seeing they were American, he switched to English. Can I help you? Chandler did not know what to say. How do you explain carrying a dead man's photograph for 40 years? How do you tell a son that you killed his father? That you sat with him while he died? That you've carried his image like a prayer or a curse for half a lifetime? My name is Robert Chandler, he began. I was a soldier in the American Army during the war. I fought in Belgium. Near Bastogne. In December 1944. Peter Hoffman's expression changed. Became guarded. What does this have to do with me? Chandler reached into his pocket. His hand was shaking. He pulled out the photograph. Worn. Faded. Creased from 40 years of being carried and looked at and held. He held it out toward Peter. I believe this is your mother, Chandler said. And you? I've been carrying it since the war. I wanted to return it. Peter took the photograph. He stared at it. His face went pale. His hands began to tremble. Where did you get this? He asked quietly. From your father, Chandler said. He was wounded. I found him. I tried to help him. He showed me this photo. Of you and your mother. Then he died. Peter's eyes filled with tears. You killed him? Yes, Chandler said. There was no point in lying. No point in softening the truth. I shot him during a firefight. When I found him, he was dying. I stayed with him. I gave him morphine. He died while I held his hand. Peter was crying now, tears running down his face. Why? Why did you keep this? Because I needed to remember, Chandler said. I needed to remember that he was a person. That he had a family. That his death mattered. I've carried your photograph for 40 years because I couldn't let him become just another casualty. Another number. Another forgotten soldier. Peter lowered himself slowly into a chair in the hallway. He stared at the photograph. At his mother's face. At his own face as a child. A face he barely remembered being. We never knew what happened to him, Peter said quietly. He was just listed as missing in action. Then, years later, declared dead. We never knew where he died. How he died. Whether he suffered. My mother waited for him until the day she died, hoping somehow he would come home. When did she die? Chandler asked. Last year, Peter said. She was 87. She never remarried. She said she was still married to my father, even if he was gone. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Peter asked, what was it like? When he died? Chandler could have lied. He could have said it was quick and painless. That the German soldier simply closed his eyes and slipped away. But he had carried the truth for 40 years. He owed this man the truth. He was in pain, Chandler said. He'd been shot in the abdomen. He was bleeding badly. I tried to help, but there wasn't much I could do. He knew he was dying. He was crying. Not from the pain, I think. But from knowing he'd never see your mother again. Never see you again. Peter nodded slowly, tears still flowing. Did he say anything? He spoke in German. I didn't understand most of it. But he said, family. Family. He wanted me to know he had a family. Did he suffer long? I gave him morphine, Chandler said. It helped with the pain. I stayed with him until he stopped breathing. He wasn't alone. Peter looked up at Chandler. His eyes were red from crying, but there was something else in them now. Not anger. Not hatred. Something softer. Something like gratitude. "Thank you," Peter said quietly. "Thank you for staying with him. Thank you for carrying this photograph. Thank you for coming here to return it." They talked for another hour. Peter invited them inside. He made coffee. He told them about his father. Karl Hoffman had been a schoolteacher before the war. He loved music. He played violin. He was kind to his students. He did not believe in Hitler or the Nazi Party, but he had been conscripted anyway. He wrote letters home when he could. His last letter arrived in November 1944. Then nothing. Then silence that lasted 40 years until an American man knocked on his son's door with a worn photograph. When Chandler and Dorothy finally left, Peter walked them to their car. He shook Chandler's hand. "My father died far from home," Peter said. "But he did not die alone. You gave him dignity at the end. You remembered him when the world forgot him. That is no small thing." Chandler nodded, unable to speak. He got into the car. Dorothy drove. They were halfway back to Frankfurt before Chandler finally cried. Not the brief, controlled crying of before, but deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. 40 years of grief and guilt and memory finally releasing. Dorothy pulled the car to the side of the road and held him while he wept. When he finally stopped, when the tears finally dried, he felt something he had not felt since December 1944. He felt light. As if a weight had been lifted. The photograph was gone. After 40 years, he had finally let it go. He had returned it to where it belonged. But the memory remained. The memory would always remain. Robert Chandler returned home to Ohio carrying something different in his pocket. Not a photograph this time, but a letter. A letter from Peter Hoffman, thanking him for returning the photograph. For remembering his father. For making sure that Karl Hoffman's death was not forgotten. Chandler kept that letter until his own death in 1992 at age 70. Dorothy found it in his drawer after the funeral, along with a journal she had never known he kept. Pages and pages of writing. Thoughts about the war. About guilt. About the burden of killing another human being. About the impossibility of reconciliation with the past. The journal ended with an entry dated October 1984. After his return from Germany. "I carried that photograph for 40 years. I thought I was carrying it for him, for the German soldier I killed. But I was carrying it for myself. I needed to remember what I had done. I needed to carry the weight of that death. I needed to never forget that war means killing people who have families and futures and dreams. Today I returned the photograph. I met his son. I told him the truth. And for the first time in 40 years, I feel like I can breathe. The war will never leave me. The things I saw, the things I did, they're part of me now. But I'm not carrying them alone anymore." Peter understood. He forgave me. Not because I deserved forgiveness, but because we both needed to let go of the past and live in the present. I don't know if what I did was right. I don't know if keeping that photograph for 40 years helped anyone or just fed my own guilt. But I know this, Karl Hoffman was a real person. He had a wife who loved him. A son who needed him. A life that was cut short by war and by me. I will never forget his face. Or his son's face. Or the look in Peter's eyes when he recognized his mother in that worn photograph. Some weights we carry forever. Some burdens never lift. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we find a way to share them with others. To distribute the weight among many shoulders instead of carrying it alone. That's the only grace I found in this. The only redemption. Not forgetting. Never forgetting. But remembering together, instead of alone. The journal was donated to the U.S. Army's Center of Military History along with Chandler's service records. It remains in their archives, a testament to one soldier's 40-year journey with the weight of war. In Munich, Peter Hoffman kept the photograph on his mantle until his death in 2011. His children inherited it. They know the story now. They know that an American soldier carried their grandfather's image for 40 years. That he crossed an ocean to return it. That even in war, humanity sometimes persists. The photograph itself, faded and worn, now resides in a frame in a house in Bavaria. A woman smiling. A child on her lap. Mountains in the background. A moment of peace captured before war destroyed it. But also proof that even destruction cannot completely erase what was loved. What was remembered. What was carried forward by those who survived. That is what endures. Not the battles. Not the victories or defeats. Not the grand strategies or the political causes. What endures are the small human connections. The moments of compassion between enemies. The burden of memory carried across decades. The simple act of remembering that the person you killed was a person. That his life mattered. That his death meant something. 40 years is a long time to carry a photograph. But memory is not measured in time. Memory is measured in weight. And some weights, once shouldered, are never truly set down. They become part of who we are. Part of what we carry. Part of the price we pay for being human in a world that sometimes forgets humanity. Robert Chandler carried a photograph for 40 years. But what he really carried was the knowledge that war, no matter how necessary, no matter how just the cause, is always fought by people who have mothers and fathers and wives and children. People who bleed. People who cry. People who die far from home while someone waits for them to return. He carried that knowledge until the day he died. And in carrying it, he transformed a killing into something else. Not redemption. Not absolution. But remembrance. Acknowledgement. A refusal to let death become anonymous. In the end, perhaps that is all any of us can do. Remember. Bear witness. Carry forward the stories of those who fell, so their deaths are not reduced to statistics in history books. Robert Chandler understood this. He carried it in his pocket for 40 years. He carried it in his heart for 50. And in carrying it, he gave meaning to one German soldier's death in a Belgian forest on a cold December day in 1944. That meaning outlived both of them. It outlives us all. It is the only thing that endures when everything else has turned to dust.